I thought we should talk about pleasure and pain because, as you know, the teaching puts forward the concept that says what we're actually really looking for, meaning what will really satisfy us in the end. We can be looking for all sorts of things, and we get it, and then we realize, no, that's not it. We go on to something else. So what it means is ultimately what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is a way of being in life whereby life continues to be lived in practical terms according to the circumstances that we're faced with, without the continuous arising of the different forms of suffering. So that means that is what the teaching describes as living happily, happiness through continuous unbroken peace of mind, and peace of mind is not the gaining of anything, but actually the falling away, the reducing eventually to a point where it no longer has the seed from which to arise, the reducing elimination of suffering. And it turns out that suffering is always attitudinal to circumstance and not circumstance itself. Circumstance itself is part of what in the teaching is referred to as the flow of life. So from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep at night, there is a continuous flow of circumstance. That is referred to as the flow of life. And then, as we spoke about recently, the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. Life will be pleasurable if the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences. And life will be painful if the circumstance is not in line with your biological preferences. So that determines whether the circumstance at a particular moment is either pleasure or pain. And so if you have two people, they're going to have different preferences. So you might be out in the sun, and one person finds that circumstance to be painful because the sun is not in line with their biological preferences, and another person finds it extremely pleasurable. And within the category of pleasure and pain, we can break it down into three different categories: physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. Neither of those, or none of those, on their own have anything to do with suffering. They in themselves are just the pleasure or pain. So physical pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, financial pleasure or pain. Now, emotional pleasure or pain is the one that tends to confuse people. They think, well, if it's emotional pain, that's suffering, isn't it? No, that's still part of the spectrum of pleasure or pain, and the suffering is a result of your attitude to that pleasure or pain. What is the attitude that tends to lead to suffering? The attitude that leads to suffering, as described in this teaching, is the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes. And what is the attitude that sets in place such that the suffering no longer arises? Well, we could call it the attitude of non-doership and the attitude of non-attachment, but more precisely, it's actually just the absence, the dissolving of the attitude of doership and the attitude of non-doership. So you don't really replace one set of beliefs with a new set of beliefs. It isn't the replacing of the belief, I am the doer, and I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be happy, with the belief, I am not the doer, and I don't need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be happy. That if we had the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment, and it happened to be like that, it would, in a sense, be another lens that we are, another belief system that we're seeing life through. So the attitude of non-doership and the attitude of non-attachment is more accurately described as the falling away of the attitude of doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes. So let's just elaborate on the physical pleasure. It's fairly straightforward. So these are going to be examples. Just if you stub your toe, physical pain. If you have a nice tasting strawberry that's in line with your biological preferences, that's a form of physical pleasure. If someone gives you a massage, that's physical pleasure. If you cut your finger, that can be physical pain. If you taste a very sour lemon, that might be physical pain. If you have a shower and it's way too hot, it can be physical pain. For someone else, the hot shower is physical pleasure. Then emotional pleasure and emotional pain. If someone says that you have done a fantastic job, then that is emotional pleasure. If someone tells you that you are a great friend, that's emotional pleasure. If someone comments on a painting that you produced and says that it's wonderful, that can be emotional pleasure. If someone tells you you're a terrible friend and you've let them down, that's emotional pain. If someone that you haven't seen for many years turns up, it can be emotional pleasure. If someone that you love dies, it's emotional pain. Now, in the same way as the other pains, like physical pain, when you stub your toe, the circumstance is just pleasure or pain. If you have the attitude of attachment and the doership kicking in, then that is what generates the suffering. The suffering in relation to the circumstance, let's say. And in the same way, the emotional pleasure and pain is exactly that. It's pleasure or pain, and then if our attitude of doership and attachment kicks in, the emotional pain can turn into suffering. So when Ramana was giving a satsang one time, he received some news that a childhood friend of his had died. And when he read the note, a tear came to his eyes. And so that is a sign that because he loved his friend, the news that his friend had died was sad. So the sadness is emotional pain. Now, you wouldn't expect to read the note and to feel excited, right? Some people might think that when attachment to outcomes falls away, you would read the note and you feel nothing. Attachment to outcome doesn't mean that your capacity to feel, to experience, goes away. What it means is that you will experience that, but then the attitude of doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes doesn't kick in. So it makes sense. You receive news and there is an emotional response. Let's take sadness. emotional response of sadness, and yet your connection to yourself remains unbroken, which means you understand that these are things that happen in the flow of life. They are things that are not pleasurable according to your preferences. However, you understand that your completeness remains unaffected by the loss of someone that you love, that your sense of self is not dependent on your circumstance remaining consistent. Because in life, nothing remains consistent. So in the same way as we mentioned yesterday, biological anger is an emotional pleasure or pain. It's not pleasure, it's pain, but it fits into the spectrum of emotional pleasure or pain. Sadness fits into the spectrum of emotional pleasure or pain. And so in the same way as if someone steps on, well, puts something heavy on your foot, then you wouldn't expect the biological reaction to be one of clapping and excitement. It just doesn't make sense for that to be the case. And often the assumption is that the biological reaction of anger and the biological reaction of sadness is something that will end. And yet it doesn't make sense, because people don't assume that the biological reaction of excitement or pleasure is going to end. So if a sage sees someone that they haven't seen for 5 years, someone they like, we don't expect them to be free of the emotional pleasure. It's like, oh wow, I haven't seen you for so long. How nice. And there's a genuine arising of emotional pleasure. So why wouldn't there be the capacity for emotional pain to arise? And remembering that the suffering is very different to the emotional pleasure and the emotional pain. Emotional pain is, I am sad that I won't get to see my friend again. We shared many wonderful times together, but I know that that is not an attack on my happiness. So there is sadness and no suffering. When a relationship ends and there is sadness, but there isn't a clarity about one's own self, then the sadness becomes the basis on which the suffering kicks in. And the suffering could be shame about feeling inadequate, and that's why the relationship ended, or blame towards the other for having done certain things and chosen a certain path. Worry about not being able to find another relationship. All of those psychological movements are the suffering that can very often arise when the biological sadness kicks in. Just 1 second.
My question is regarding pleasure and pain. Is it right that those experiences are also not just vertical in time, but they are also horizontal, right?
Can you get that, both of them on 5? So that's the description that's often given to distinguish between the biological reaction and the psychological reaction, is that the biological reaction is vertical in time, means it's temporary and circumstantial, whereas the psychological reaction of suffering tends to be horizontal in time and carries on beyond the circumstance. Now, when it comes to something like sadness, and it can seem like, well, it's horizontal in time because the sadness can persist. And in the case of the example I used with Ramana, a tear came to his eye, and then he folded up the note, clapped his hands and said, "Lunchtime." So the sadness sort of arose and subsided quite quickly. But even if it arose and it was there for half an hour or even a day, in a way you could look at it, if it's there for a day, obviously it's horizontal in time because it's 12 hours. But what the horizontal in time is referring to in the psychological suffering is that where, someone does something to us, steals something from us or breaks something, and then we have a story about it that can go on for years. So that's really the horizontal in time, whereas it comes to certain emotions, require the body to process them. And so you can have emotional pain, which can extend for some time, and yet it's still considered vertical in time, which sounds like a contradiction. It is, in a way, it's a contradiction. It's just a matter of understanding what the horizontal in time means. And really it means that once a circumstance is finished, do we keep the circumstance alive in our thinking? And so if we find that the sadness arises, it hangs around for an hour or so and then subsides and there's peace, then we can have a fair idea that that is just the vertical life cycle of the sadness. And it doesn't, even though it's there for an hour or so, it still doesn't fit into the category of horizontal in time, because it's not psychological. So the question always comes down to, is it psychological suffering, or is it biological pain? And we know the difference by being able to feel the quality of the difference between the two.
That means that if a thought about the circumstance keeps popping up in my mind just repeatedly, then it's suffering, obviously.
A circumstance of the past?
The past, I guess.
Yeah, if it's well, it depends on what the quality of the thought is, obviously. If it's blame, if it's guilt, then it's definitely suffering. Even if it's about a thought that keeps occurring about something in the present, then if it fits into the category of complaining, it's suffering. You could find that you're in the company of someone that is doing something that's not in line with your biological preference, and you keep having a biological reaction to what they're doing. And the most sensible thing to do, if you can, is to remove yourself from that situation, because it's not in line with your preferences. But in the end, these descriptions are there simply to give you a pointer, and it's your own discernment, your own feeling the thought, feeling what effect it's having, that will tell you whether it's biological pain or suffering.
I have the feeling that the teachings are a bit inaccurate as far as the definition of your circumstances. Or you said circumstances, the flow of life generates pleasure or pain.
The flow of life is either pleasure or pain.
Exactly, yes. And I have the feeling it would be more accurate to say that our thinking determines if anything on the outside is pleasure or pain. It's easily seen. When you say listening to music is pleasure, then it sounds like whenever I listen to music, it's pleasurable, and we all know that's not true. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be more accurate to have an inside-out approach that says that the flow or the quality of your thinking determines if anything on the outside is pleasurable to you? I would like to take it to a more extreme example. For example, if somebody cuts themselves, and there could be all kinds of sensations there. I think there are even people I've heard of who can eliminate pain, bodily pain, while they hurt themselves, yogis, and so on. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so what you're saying is correct. But the teaching actually says that the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And when it talks about the flow of life, it means not you on the outside of the flow of life, and then you interacting with the flow of life, but you are part of the flow of life. So the flow of life is either pleasure or pain, and it will be pleasure if what is happening in the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences. So in saying that, it means that if there is music in this moment, it will be pleasurable if it's in line with your biological preferences. So if you're really tired in that moment, your biological preferences are not to listen to music, possibly. And so, therefore, the music will be painful, whereas at another point in time, if you're not tired, and then music is music you like, then it's in line with your biological preference in that moment. So it's pleasure in one moment and pain in another moment. And so why it talks about biological preference rather than thinking is because preference includes everything in your body at that point in time, which means if certain pleasures are thought-based pleasures, then it will be talking about your biological preference as it relates to thought. But some other preferences are not thought-based, but actually feeling-based. So when it comes to pain, I've used this example before, and we put your thumb in a vice and we start tightening it. The pain, the biological pain, is independent of your thinking. It's a physical pain. And so the physical sensation will be registered in the brain. Your thinking about it may intensify or decrease that pain. So a yogi who has certain yogic practices may be able to shut off certain faculties of the brain and therefore not feel that pain, or the pain, the complex, those practices. So assuming we're talking about the average person, but acknowledging that a yogi who has mastered certain aspects of the physical body may be able to control the neurology more effectively than someone who hasn't mastered that. But that's a separate issue in a way. So if we put a strawberry in our mouth, we don't need to think about it for it to be pleasurable. The pleasure is there in the taste, inherent in the taste. The thinking about it probably is more in the area of the suffering and our attitude to the pleasure.
I know of times when I ate strawberries and I didn't taste them. So I still think it has to do with my thinking. If my thinking is somewhere else, it might be similar to the yogic experience of shutting down something in your brain that makes you feel the taste. I'm not entirely convinced that there is a physical reaction while I'm eating strawberries if I don't think about eating strawberries and really tasting them.
So I would say there is, it's just that your attention isn't on it. And so once again, when we talk about the circumstance includes everything that is there. So if you're eating a strawberry and at the same time there's a dogfight happening that just breaks out, your circumstance includes eating the strawberry plus being in the midst of a dogfight. And you might see people breaking it up, you might be part of dealing with the situation, and then afterwards you realize that you had your strawberries in your mouth and swallowed them and didn't taste them. The taste was there, but attention was on something else. So how does this relate to what we were talking about? So if we look at it, is the teaching concept adequate? So the flow of life, which includes you and the flow of life as one unit, the flow of life in each moment is either pleasure or pain. It will be pleasurable depending on the circumstance you find yourself in, and how that circumstance aligns to your biological preferences. So I think we can. I think it is accurate in that if it is a complex circumstance, then the registering of the pleasure or pain is going to be dependent on what part of the circumstance our attention is on. But also, let's remember, as is often said, a teaching is a concept, and a concept is not the truth. A concept is pointing to something. So we wouldn't expect the concepts to be infallible, because there's always going to be a counter concept that can be put forward to any concept. We can always find something and argue an opposite concept.
My final question, at least for now, would you say that it's accurate that biological preferences can change during the day?
Absolutely. Your biological preferences are not something you can sit and write down and say, these are my biological preferences. What you can write down are your biological tendencies, or your preference tendencies, based on what you've seen yourself appreciate and not appreciate in the past. However, in your actual preference, biological preference is unique in each moment. So if you've just had a big meal, you don't have a preference for food in that moment. Whereas in 5 hours' time, you might find that your biological preference is for food. And so you can't ever know what your biological preferences are ahead of time.
Thank you.
So that biological sadness is a tricky one, I guess, because I can relate to your question. It can come back on a daily basis, for example, and if it comes back, I'm still not less liberated or enlightened than, for example, Ramana, who can have a tear in his eyes and say, okay, let's go and have a lunch. Mm-hmm. I guess it's still sort of valid.
Yes, it's very valid, because in fact that doesn't mean that Ramana didn't feel sad later on in the evening when he had the memory of his friend dying. And so it can come back. And there are also moods are a good one. So this is an example of the concept that a concept is never going to be absolute. It's not going to be able to cover a situation absolutely. And so sometimes we have to go towards and see what the principle or not the principle, what in principle the concept is pointing at. And so when it says that that psychological suffering is horizontal in time and biological pleasure or pain is vertical in time, what it's implying is that the pain will be experienced given the circumstance. And circumstance is momentary. And then the psychological pain is something that carries on after the circumstance. So if we look at something like a relationship ending or a friend dying, the circumstance is that they are dead for an extended period of time. And so each time there is a memory, you may well feel sadness. If the sadness extends so this is once again where the question of your own
tricky one.
The question of your own assessment of whether the sadness is sadness or whether it's sadness plus guilt and blame and regret and then it's suffering. There is, moods. For example, you can be tired, and you're tired for an extended period of time, and tiredness, you could say, is biological pain. If you're tired but you have to keep working, then that's biological pain, and it extends over a period of time. But actually, it's a whole lot of vertical periods of time. If that makes sense. So I concede that this is a concept that is hopefully pointing at the nature of suffering, that says suffering holds on to something that has happened in the past and doesn't let it die. maybe we can talk about free will and predestiny and decision making. So the teaching also puts forward the concept that life is a predetermined story, unfolding moment after moment after moment. That whatever happens in each moment is what was destined to happen in that moment. And what happens includes your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings, your actions, and the consequences. So nothing is outside of the destined story of life. It's not that you stand outside of the destined story of life. You are actually included in the destined story of life. So what that really is saying is that whatever you do is what you were destined to do. Whatever you do is not your doing, but a happening according to the story of life. And why that is particularly important is because suffering is an attitude to circumstance that tends to be based on the idea that I am the one that created this. I'm the one that acted that way, and I acted based on my own volition, based on my own free will. And we see ourselves as an independent entity in life. Independent entity means isolated in a way, like unaffected by anything else. I think it's fair to say that until we start investigating this is the notion that people have of themselves, that we are a separate, independent entity. And what that really means is that they view themselves subconsciously as an entity that has grown up in a vacuum, meaning an entity that is unaffected by anything else. Because if we see ourselves as affected by external factors, then the notion of volition, personal volition, doesn't make sense anymore. Because as soon as we see ourselves influenced by external factors, well, then my choice is influenced. My action is influenced. And if my action is influenced, is it really my action? If we come to see that I am continually affected by life, I am never insulated from life. No one has ever been insulated from life. Even if you've been put into a room for your whole life, you've not been insulated from what is in that room, which is life. And so the human being is always a result of their connection to life. And so as we appreciate this, as we see this clearly, it can become clearer that I am not a separate, independent entity. It's not possible to be a separate, independent entity. We are an entity that is not separate from life. Life is always impacting us. So in this moment, life is functioning through Roger, and so part of life is the words coming out of my mouth. And so you're not insulated from the words. You weren't insulated from the words of your parents and from the grass in the garden when you were crawling on the grass as a baby. And you're not insulated from the birds that fly across your vista. All of that is one with the body-mind organism, And therefore the body-mind organism is influenced by everything on the outside. And so it can become obvious that whatever I do, whatever I say, whatever I feel is a result of the body-mind organism and essentially its genes, and how those genes were affected and impacted by the external circumstance. So genes and up-to-date conditioning, so your up-to-date conditioning is what has come in from the external circumstance. They're not really two things. You don't have your genes and the up-to-date conditioning. You have a gene that is always exposed to the conditioning of the world in that particular moment. And so your genes and up-to-date conditioning are one single unit, essentially. And we'll function according to our makeup, which is genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so therefore, your functioning is predetermined by everything that came before.
And this also includes the thoughts that I'm having, is that correct?
Most
because
definitely.
I can only ever come up with things in my mind about what I've learned, what I have encountered.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you have a thought, about this is my favorite tree, a thought about prejudices, even hatred thoughts, they are completely determined by what you are exposed to.
The thought that just came up is that one might think that maybe this was true when one was a child and one wasn't that skeptical or critical and received a lot of input from parents and the environment and didn't question it. But as one grows older, one is more curious and don't just accept what other people say. So what you said is maybe true for young people, but no longer for when you're older.
Well, if we look at it, your capacity of discernment and your capacity of questioning is just an output of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So as your genes, as the human develops, and the intelligence or the intellect develops, and we start seeing the shortcomings of just believing the things, then we start questioning. So that questioning is actually a function of the body-mind organism. So even if you have more, so when you make a choice to go to university, for example, and someone says, well, now that was my doing, and anything that happened after that point in time, any conditioning that happened in university that then gave me more capacity to function, let's say, as a doctor, that was a result of my choice to go to university. But when we look at that choice, we find that the choice was based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning at that point in time. So that choice to go to university, which seems like my choice, is a choice that actually came out of their particular makeup, which was dependent on all the things that came before. So we can't ever escape, even as an adult. We may have a new capacity, but that new capacity is still part of our makeup.
guess I just wanted to point out that one can make the mistake that after hearing these concepts, this is no longer going to be the case.
That you can question, for example, and
that you can choose whether you're conditioned or not, or that life affects you.
well, you can't.
Yeah, that's what I'm pointing to. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are always going to be conditioned till the day we die by life. It's just that some things. So life is always delivering new conditioning. Even going out into the sun is new conditioning. So the conditioning is not limited to people's opinions of things. If you're exposed to a vicious dog, that is new conditioning. And so life is always going to be delivering new conditioning. How that conditioning affects us, we won't know. There was conditioning that was delivered to us when we were a child, and the child didn't have the capacity to discern or to question. And then, therefore, the new conditioning that life was delivering affected us a particular way. As an adult, life continues to deliver new conditioning, but how that new conditioning affects us may be different than when we were a child. And yet, the description of how it affects us is still based on the new conditioning that life is delivering and our genes and up-to-date conditioning at that point in time. Meaning that our capacity to discern and to question is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning at that point in time. Does that sit okay
yes,
with you?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to explain, because it's very clear to me, but I can see how it can be a confusing thing, because we talk about genes and up-to-date conditioning, and in science, genes are a very particular aspect of the human being. When I talk about genes, I mean the genes are going to turn into the whole of us. Our genes turn into our muscles, our eye color, our brain structure. The whole of the human instrument is what I mean by genes. I don't mean that there is a body and then inside the body there are genes, but rather the genes grow into the entirety of the human body. So genes and up-to-date conditioning means when the sperm and the egg come together, our genetic blueprint is formed. And then that organism starts to grow, and it grows impersonally. It doesn't require the organism to control the growing. The growing is inherent in the blueprint. So we started off as sperm and an egg, blueprint is in place, and then the body grows according to that blueprint. And it continues to grow through our whole life. The cells, certain cells die and then new ones take their place. And so the liver and the heart and the whole organism is continually growing. And so the brain grows into its capacity to process information. But if the genetic structure wasn't exposed to life, it would have no up-to-date conditioning. It's not possible to have an organism that isn't exposed to life. But in theory, if we say you have an organism that isn't exposed to life, then you won't end up with a person as we know ourselves, because we are the growing genes and all of the up-to-date conditioning, all of the new conditioning, which cumulatively we call up-to-date conditioning. So genes and up-to-date conditioning means the person as they are, and all of their faculties of thinking and of feeling and of the senses.
So everybody has his genes and up-to-date conditioning?
Everybody is genes and up-to-date.
Is genes and up-to-date conditioning?
Yeah.
And is it correct to say that the older one gets, the more complicated it is to change that up-to-date conditioning, because that up-to-date conditioning I have so far, that I am so far, influences or has to influence how I will receive the new up-to-date condition, the new conditioning.
Yes. How you will receive the new conditioning is through the filter of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so if someone's belief system is reinforced year after year after year after year, that belief system is effectively much stronger because of the many years that it's being reinforced. However, we don't know that each year that we are living, we don't know that our existing belief system is being reinforced, because at some point we start contemplating things differently. And the point where we start contemplating things differently might be the point where our beliefs are being weakened. And so then, in fact, the longer that you live, the more time is being spent on the dissolution of the belief system. So it really comes down to a question of at what point does the new conditioning come in a way that starts to undo the existing belief systems. So if it comes in at age 30, and then the subsequent 20 years from 30 to 50 may actually be undoing rather than strengthening the existing beliefs. So it's not really a question that we can answer. It doesn't mean that the older someone gets, the less likely they are to be liberated, because they might be getting older, and the process of liberation is actually happening as they're getting older.
I would like to know where does the following fit in? Thoughts that seem to rise out of the blue. Where do they come from? Or where do they fit in with the teachings?
So the description is still the same, that in each moment the thoughts, the feelings, the actions are part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning as it reacts to the present circumstance. And so a thought that comes out of the blue can seem like, well, but that's got nothing to do with my current circumstance. And yet I would say it does, because if your circumstance was different, then you may well have been involved in something in a different circumstance, doing, actively working on something, and then that thought wouldn't have arisen because there wouldn't have been the space. So It's if you're sitting on a chair with nothing to do, then you might have thoughts come out of the blue. And similarly, it doesn't have to be sitting on a chair. You might be talking to someone, and then a thought comes into your mind as you're talking to someone. But the explanation is it's still a result of your genes and your up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you're in, even though it seems like that thought is not related to the circumstance. It just means that the circumstance as it is supportive of that thought that seems completely unrelated popping up. So you'd find that that thought has something to do with your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it might be a thought about your mother, for example, that pops out of the blue and seems to have nothing to do with that circumstance, but it has very much to do with your genes and up-to-date conditioning, because your mother has obviously been part of your up-to-date conditioning. And if you have a thought about, or an image pop into your head, and you don't know what that image is, someone might say, well, I've never seen this person before, and an image of their face popped up. I would say it's a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which may mean you don't remember who that person is, but it doesn't necessarily prove that you've not ever come in contact with that person. It may well be that it is carried over from some other time, even prior to your own birth. We don't really understand the complexity of how all of this works. And so within your genetic blueprint, these memories could have existed before and carried over from some previous time.
Roger, what about events? For example, if I look final of Champions League and I'm fond of Tottenham, do I worry for nothing because everything already happened?
So, tell me again, what about events? If you're fond of the Champions League, you said?
Well, I understand about genetics and about up-to-date conditioning on the personal level, but what about events? For example, I took an example of final of Champions League.
Okay, yeah.
Is story already written that already happened, but just I didn't see final?
So it's still exciting. You get to see what is predetermined only when it's happening. Stephen Hawking wrote an essay, and the essay is called "Is Life Predetermined?" ? And then the first sentence of the essay is, yes, it is. However, knowing that it's predetermined doesn't allow us to know what is predetermined. And so we get to live life knowing that what will happen is destined to happen, but not knowing what is destined. And so that means in practice you can turn the television on and watch the Champions League and be excited about whether they're going to score the goal that has, once the ball has been passed from the goalkeeper all the way down to the attackers. and you can be on the edge of your seat, even though the goal, if it gets scored, in theory has already happened a long time ago. Now that we're talking about predetermination, because I see that this is really about beliefs, that this transformation is about beliefs. Actually, when we start seeing what the transformation is about, even though it feels very mystical, a lot of the mystical experience that we have is because things are changing. And as things change, there is a corresponding experience. And often we don't, when the experiences happen, we don't necessarily see them as linked to change that is happening. We just experience something new, and it feels very mystical and profound, and it is, but we might benefit by contemplating whether that change, where it comes from, why, or not necessarily the change, but that experience, what leads to it. And so I would suggest that all of the changes are because the body-mind organism is changing. And one of the biggest principles in the change is the changing of belief structures. Belief structures have an amazing impact and capacity on how life is experienced. And really what it means is we need to learn in time how to think. It's not so much about the learning about the content or learning. So real learning is not about knowledge, not learning knowledge, but learning how to think, the principles of thinking. And part of the development of humans sets in place thinking that isn't very developed, types of thinking, forms of thinking that isn't very developed. And the process, very indirectly, is changing how we actually think. So, for example, what was mentioned earlier is, as we get older, we start to learn to question information that's being given to us. And that's a huge change in principle, to question what we believe. And it's not about content, it's about a principle towards any content. It's like I need to verify whether I should believe this concept or should hold this concept as accurate. Whereas what we tend to do is just believe what sounds reasonable to us at first. That tends to be how we develop, and so we start thinking that way, where we don't appreciate the relativeness of our senses. If we don't appreciate the relativeness of our senses, if we don't appreciate the relativeness of our brain and the relativeness of our conclusions, and even the relativeness of our insights that we have insights and they feel like they're not relative. When you have an insight, it feels like, that's absolute. It's not, it's relative. And so as we start to learn that this information, these senses, are all relative. What that means is the brain is a relative instrument conditioned by life, and so it can only produce relative outputs. And once we learn to relate to the outputs as relative, that's a very big improvement in the quality of our thinking. Now, it might sound like I'm saying, as a child, we just believe everything, and then as adults, we don't just believe everything. The truth is that most adults just believe everything. So this improvement in the quality of thinking I'm talking about doesn't happen for the majority of the population. And when it does start happening, that's where the liberation actually comes from. That's where the change in experience comes from. Because the brain is no longer relating to objects and to thoughts and to sensations in the same absolute way that it did before. That creates an openness, it creates a space, it creates the capacity for the core essence that is always functioning through the human being to be recognized. Now, all of these things are experienced as mystical and profound, and they could be as simple as neurological changes based on one's ability to think differently. I am pretty sure, based on very interested observation of this whole process, that that's actually what happens. And so at some point, spirituality turns into critical thinking, much more critical thinking. And because you can see a lot of people in non-duality teachings, and not only non-duality teachings, that believe a lot of stuff that at some point you will go beyond and say, I can't believe that anymore. Now, that isn't a criticism of the non-duality teachings at all, because the teachings are extremely profound and wise. They understand what I've just been describing. They understand it so much that they say, we will create stories, effective stories, to bring about change. And so why did I start all this? I started all this because I made some fairly bold statements that everyone's happy with, that life is completely predetermined. That everything has already happened.
When you say a change the way we are thinking, or it's pretty obvious that we have no control about thinking, or series of thoughts, or whatever. And when we say critical thinking and the other kind of thinking, when I want to, let's say, think the other way, I don't know how to do this because there is series of thoughts that is just coming. Do we really think in some way, or it is just series of thoughts that is coming to us?
Well, once again, certain frameworks, because they are trying to bring about a certain change, will describe thoughts as, popping out of nothing. And why is that? So I think that's great. It's a very ingenious way of undoing our relationship to thinking in a way that will allow a witnessing of thoughts to happen. Now, I don't think that I would agree absolutely with the idea that thoughts pop out of nothing, that everything pops out of nothing. But it's a very important framework, those teachings that say everything arises out of nothing, spontaneously arises, because it creates, once we hear that and once it resonates with us, we start seeing what we used to see as causal in a different light. Now, that doesn't mean we're now seeing things truly. we might be seeing what is actually causal, but our brain now is programmed to see it differently and then think that it's now seeing it as is truth. Why I don't have a problem with that is that change is absolutely necessary. The change that of being able to witness something from a different perspective to the involved way that we tend to have as part of our natural development. We see everything in a very involved manner. And so witnessing life is a very, very important part of critical thinking. So that explanation that thoughts pop out of nowhere, to me, is not that it won't pass a lot of critical thinking criticism, that particular concept, unless the teacher says to the critical thinker who is criticizing it, if the teacher explains why they're saying that, then the critical thinker might go, wow, now it passes critical thinking, because the teacher is explaining to the critical thinker who says, you're making these bold statements that are not verifiable. And the teacher says, I know, I'm not putting them forward as truth. I'm putting them forward as a concept that is specifically aimed at bringing about this change. And then the critical thinker might say, wow, I apologize for thinking that you weren't being critical in your thinking. You're actually being extremely critical because you've explained why you're putting forward a concept that can't be justified, but you're also telling me that you understand that it's not meant to be truth. If you follow what I'm doing. So let's go back to your question, which is, do thoughts simply just pop out? I would say in principle, we can look at it that way, but I would say they pop out of a brain. They pop out of a neurological network. Now, you're not in control of the neurological network, and you're not in control of the thoughts that pop out of it. So from your perspective, you say they just pop out. And whether they pop out of nothing or empty space, or whether they pop out of a neural network, is sort of irrelevant. Your attitude to them is that they come and they're not in your control. From a critical thinking point of view, I'd much rather say that they come out of the brain, which is part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors you were never in control of. And the brain will produce thoughts based on its design, which includes up-to-date conditioning and things.
I would like to talk about free will. What is the best way to make someone see in a friendly way that we don't have free will, although they say we do have free will? If I only had 5 minutes, because I always. It's not very often that I get into these conversations, but with my sister, who has changed as far as the teachings are concerned. Whenever I talk with her about it, it used to be, I hate the idea of predetermination, and now she loves it, which is a good sign. And but I often come across the question of, is there a free will? And I can say that with all the teachings I've heard, with all the satsangs I've heard, it makes sense to me because of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. I guess that must be taken into account if you explain it. But is there a kind of knockout knockout fact that you could give to somebody who says, but?
I mean, one thing we have to do is see that it's not actually important to convince anyone, right? Because if we really see that there is no free will and it's all predetermined, then we can conclude that maybe it's predetermined for them not to agree with us. So in a friend, that's right. So then you can appreciate from your own experience that coming to see life this way can be very liberating. And so that would be our motivation for sharing this with someone and seeing if they agree with us or if they can see life that way. But once we've done what we can, then we leave the outcome up to life. So as soon as you put it forward and they say, that's a load of nonsense, and they bring up another topic, then you go, oh, it was predetermined for me to put it forward, for them to say it was a load of nonsense, and for them clearly not to be interested in discussing it further. They've gone on to, and we can be at peace with that. However, in principle, your question is also valid. Is there, what is the most convincing argument you could put forward to someone if you're trying to demonstrate? I wouldn't say, well, I'm not going to use your words because you said we have to prove to them that we don't have free will. Funnily enough, the teaching says we do have free will, right? And that might seem odd because you've heard the teaching over and over and over again. And in fact, one of the underlying principles is it says everything is completely predetermined. And so then I can very much appreciate, especially from first-hand experience, why someone would say, well, in that case, if everything's predetermined, we don't have free will. You can't have free will if everything is predetermined. And this is what I had said to Ramesh one time, when I heard him say, everything is completely predetermined, and yet you have complete free will in the moment to do it whatever you think or feel to do. And I was sitting in Bombay, and I went to see him before knowing his teaching with a deep conviction for myself that everything was unfolding one way, and that I wasn't in control of how it unfolds, including my thoughts and my feelings and my actions. That was all part of the predetermined unfolding of life, according to how I saw it. I went to see Ramesh without being aware of the teaching, and he said everything is predetermined. I thought, fantastic, completely agree, Went there many times, and one day I heard, and yet you have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do. Now, he probably said that many times before when I was there, but I just didn't register. And this day I registered. I said, hand up. I said, how can we have free will if everything's predetermined? And he said, Roger, from your own experience, go to your own experience. Don't you have the feeling that you are free to do whatever you think or feel to do? And I kept going to the theory. And the theory is that whatever I do is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and therefore I don't have free will. And that is the theory in the teaching, except the teaching wants things to be as much in line with what is as possible. So the teaching wants to put forward concepts that are as much in line with what is as possible, which means looking at the fundamental theory, which is saying that whatever you do is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So that concept is in there. But then what is also includes our experience in the moment. And so in theory, there's a theory about, in theory everything is atoms or everything is consciousness. That's the fundamental theory. But in practice, this is plastic. And someone would say, well, in practice it's plastic, but really it's just atoms. Say, well, that's the theory, that it's just atoms. And they go, well, it's not theory, it's actual. So, well, if I got the chair and hit you over the head with the chair, you would say I hit you over the head with a chair, not I hit you over the head with a bunch of atoms. Right? And so I just couldn't settle on the, in practice, you have complete free will to do whatever you think or feel to do, because I had immersed myself so deeply in the theory and seen the theory so deeply that there was no space inside of me to accept in practice I have the feeling of free will. And so in continuing to assert that, because in theory everything is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, it then prevents us from seeing what is also right here, which is the feeling, the momentary experience that you can get up and go and get a glass of water at any point in time when you feel like it. Which is what the teaching, what Ramesh was pointing at, that everything is completely predetermined, and yet you can do whatever you think or feel to do. And whatever you think or feel to do is what was predetermined. And so I couldn't get this for so long. I just thought, so what's the point of saying you have free will if in fact your free will is part of what's predetermined? I thought it was sort of regressing back. I thought that the ultimate understanding is to see you have no free will. And then I realized, no, the ultimate is to be able to marry the two and hold the paradox. And the paradox is much more integrated and much more holistic than seeing just one side of the paradox. And so this is why I didn't want to reassert in the words you use that what would be the most convincing argument to show someone we have no free will, because actually in the teaching it says, and you have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do. So we need to understand what it means by free will in the moment, and really it means that if you go to your experience, it doesn't feel like you are a slave. It doesn't feel like you are a puppet at the end of a string. And thank goodness that this free will, this feeling of free will, is a great gift. If there wasn't a paradox, and it was all in line with the theory that whatever we do is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, then we would feel like we are not free. It would feel like we are completely being controlled. And thankfully we don't have that feeling. So that's why Ramesh wanted to include in the concept something that held both, that allows us to see in principle whatever we do is not our doing, but a result of life and a result of how life has shaped us, our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So we need to see that deeply. That's what affects our attitude. That's what allows the attitude of guilt and shame and pride to fall away. The recognition that, if I fail at something, it's because I wasn't equipped to succeed. And I wasn't equipped because life didn't equip me, not because I failed, because of my own shortcomings of being able to succeed at equipping myself. I'm not the one that equips myself. And similarly, if we really succeed at something, we say, I only really succeeded because life equipped me that way. So I can't take personal pride in that. I can appreciate the pleasure that society will pile on me, and the pleasure of producing a successful project, let's say. But pride doesn't have any space because, really, it was good luck that I was equipped this way. So how do we convince someone that we're not in control? That's what I would rather say, rather than using the word free will. So still in the teaching, when it says you have complete free will in the moment, it's pointing to your actual experience, which is you can do whatever you like, but whatever you like, because someone says, no, I can't do whatever I like, I can only do what my genes and up-to-date conditioning allow me to do. And I say, well, I agree, right? Clear, because that's the teaching. I go, great, you've got that. But right in this moment, think about anything that is within your physical and financial capacities, and are you not free to do it? You can get on the internet right now. No one's stopping you getting on there. You can book a ticket to, America or wherever. And that's what it's pointing at, is are you not free in experience? Because the notion that we are not, that we have no free will can come in and can become a new psychological obstacle that creates a depression or a despair. And this is trying to make sure that we see the concepts for what they're really pointing at, which is they're pointing at what is, rather than turning the concept into a new belief that can have its problems. So the convincing argument is the one that we've been talking about all along. So both in practice and in theory, we see that we're not in control. In practice, we can see we're not in control because you can order something from a menu, and the outcome after you've ordered it is never in your control. The waiter can come back and say, I'm very sorry, but I don't have any oranges for the orange juice you ordered. So you can see in practice, you're not in control. And in theory, you're not in control because the order that you placed was based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance that you found yourself in. So if the menu didn't have pomegranate juice on it, but you really felt like pomegranate juice, you might not ask for pomegranate juice because it's not on the menu. So that means that what you end up asking for is based on the circumstance and your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So both in theory, you're not in control because the circumstance isn't something you control. You didn't decide what goes on the menu. You didn't control your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. And even after the choice is made in practice, the outcome is not in your control. That, to me, is the simplest and most powerful argument that I could put forward, and I completely understand that it will go like water off a duck's back to many people who hear it, and they'll go, well, that doesn't prove anything. Right? It does to me if you investigate it from your own experience over and over and over. But I can also, it doesn't prove, nothing can be proved absolutely in this world. But we can see things so that the previous misunderstanding gets transcended. And so that's the strongest argument I could put forward, but I wouldn't at all ever think that it's going to be successful in the majority of cases that receive that argument.
Is that the reason? Obviously, neither predetermination, neither free will are absolute truth. Both of them are, let's say, relative truth. Mm-hmm. And is that the reason that you say that only in personal sense of I am is absolute and undeniable truth? because many other things we can see from three different perspectives, and from one perspective it's not true, from the other it is. But obviously all of these things are, let's say, relatively true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I say within the manifestation, the only truth is the impersonal sense of I am, because what it really means is you don't need to think about it. That isn't something you need to put forward a concept about. Your own existence is something that you can be one with and know directly without needing to think about it. And, outside, people can argue even that I am is not absolute, because in deep sleep, it's not there. That's why I said within the manifestation, it's the only truth. Deep sleep is effectively the collapse of the manifestation. And even that is a concept. When I say the only truth in the I am is the impersonal sense of I am is the only truth in the manifestation, that also is a concept. So there will be arguments that can show us that even I am is not truth. I've tried by adding in the the only thing in the manifestation. Then if someone says, "What do you mean by it's the only truth?" And I would say, "Well, it's ever present in the manifestation. It is whenever there is the experience, I am is there with it." So when there's an experience, the body may not be part of the experience, but the sense of I am is. So when there's an experience, a tree is not always there, but the sense of I am is. So in the context of that explanation, truth means something that doesn't come and go in the manifestation. So I am doesn't vanish halfway through the day and then come back later on. The impersonal sense of I am doesn't vanish. Your thought of I am Roger is not the impersonal sense of I am. That thought I am Roger or the presence of the body, they can drop away in meditation, for example, but the impersonal sense of I am remains.
Every time I ask question, I make conclusion that I ask question from wrong dimension. So, yeah, like I'm a little mouse from some hole, and I ask Roger, how can I get out? And you say, you are not in the hole, you are the hole. So, thank you.
Something that was just occurring to me is like, right now what I'm perceiving is the past. Like by the time whatever the image does, the flipping in the retina gets processed by the brain, I'm looking at what's already happened. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate? Or like?
Well, yeah. So if we take the model where there is an objective world and our experience is always an image of the world, not the world itself, but the image of the world. So if that's the case, then you can say, well, simply knowing that it's an image, not the world itself, is in line with the principle you're putting forward. That it is the past because the external world has now changed, and then you're seeing it just a fraction after the change. But what's really important also is the fact that, wow, I'm always seeing an image, not the world itself.
What is the world itself then?
We can't know that. We can only know it through our image of it, which is relative. And that's why, if we can't draw any absolute conclusions about anything, because our conclusions are all based on our perception. Our perception is all relative. So we can't. How can we possibly end up knowing anything when all of the information that our conclusions come from is in itself relative and limited? And yet it doesn't matter that it's limited, because all that we're really looking for is happiness in this world that we're in. And so, given that we're looking for happiness in this life, knowing the one truth in the manifestation, the one truth in this life, is enough. So, what it's pointing at is, if we come to know the impersonal sense of I am, and are able to rest there, and drop into that beingness outside of the barrage of thoughts which we now know are all relative. So we go, actually, I'm happy to just rest in the thing that is most true. And that's enough, because that's really what satisfies. All this discussion, someone might say, well, I've got totally confused and lost. Like, there's so much that we've been talking about and nuanced stuff, and really the principle that keeps getting hammered home is that our thoughts are the cause of the uncomfortableness, and our thoughts of suffering persist when there is an attitude towards them of being absolute and true. And so, in whichever way we can start to see the relativity of thought, the relativity of feelings, then that is the beginning of a detachment from them, a beginning of the breaking of involvement in them. So you mentioned Byron Katie's work, and I've never been exposed to it, but I've been on the internet long enough to see posts here and there. And so one of the things that I've seen, and I think it's probably the principle, is she says, can you know this for certain? Can you know anything for certain? And the reason that that's put forward is because with a bit of investigation you find out, well, I can't know anything for certain. And then I'm guessing she'll use that as once it becomes your own recognition that I can't know anything, that will be used as the thing that cuts off thinking. That it's like, I don't know that that's true. My friend let me down, and that just isn't how a good friend should act. Do you know that for certain? It's like, what it does, it takes you out of thinking into what is there when you're not in thinking, which is freedom from the story about me and what I need and why the other acted that way, which is because of their own volition. That's what the story says. Why I acted that way, because I'm not a good son because I did this and I should be better. So one way is saying, well, do you know that for certain? No. Or another way is saying, you are a son, but the way you act is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so if that becomes understood, then that will become the part of our functioning that undermines the story of guilt for not being a good enough son. Actually, I'm a pretty good son.
I think it's really neat when you said something about we're using critical thinking as a way. I forget the rest of your words, but I feel like I've been avoiding that for so long, so identified unconsciously with thinking that the mind can't get out of itself, so you need to, ignore it, and almost went too far with the non-dual stuff, that there was a detachment from actually living my life. Does that make sense? That you shouldn't think, but that's a thought. It's so tricky.
Yeah, and I'm not saying critical thinking on its own, because this capacity to drop out of thinking altogether and know beingness. But what critical thinking can actually aid in that, because what prevents us from dropping into being is the very opposite of critical thinking, which is, for example, relating to the content of our thoughts absolutely. So what is critical thinking? Critical thinking, and I don't know the exact definition of it, but it means having a concept, but then checking that concept out for yourself based on your own daily life experience, which means making sure that the concept can be verified and hold water based on you observing the environment that the concept is describing. That's a fundamental principle of critical thinking, is don't just believe something, but verify it for yourself based on your own observation. And also then look at another part of critical thinking is you verify something based on your observation, but then also understand that there could be other explanations that you haven't considered, that there could be some things in your observation that you're missing. And so critical thinking will never hold a conclusion as absolute, because it knows that in the next moment you can get new information that is going to change your conclusion.
Actually, it's also about seeing things from different angles.
Yes, when our critical thinking develops, we realize that whenever we describe something, we're describing it from a certain perspective, and then we start to be able to hold descriptions from different perspectives and see that they're not contradictory, but supportive in a sense, that they go together to support a description of what is from many different angles. So looking at a cylindrical tank is an interesting example. Like from front on view, if you draw a technical drawing of a cylindrical tank, the front view is going to be a rectangle. And if you draw the cylindrical tank from top view on your technical drawing, it's a circle. And so if someone is looking down at the tank and they're asked to describe what they can see, they're going to draw a circle or describe a circle. And someone else is going to describe the rectangle. Now, on the one hand, we'll think, well, which one of them is right? Because one said rectangle, the other said circle. If we can understand that from different perspectives, the cylindrical tank is seen as circular, and from front it's rectangular, and that those are two different perspectives of the one thing, then we can start to listen to spiritual teachings and realize, wow, none of them are truth. They're all describing this from different perspectives. And if we can hold all of the perspectives and understand, actually see it from the perspective, and then hold all of them together, we end up being able to see something more holistically, and also understand that from whenever we see it from a certain perspective, it's exactly that, seeing it from a certain perspective. So even the parable I mentioned yesterday of the Chinese farmer that I probably messed up, but the principle was, his attitude to circumstance was, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, we'll see. Or it'll be good from one perspective, or bad from one perspective, and then good from another perspective. So that is an example of critical thinking, as opposed to the farmer that says, oh, this is terrible, and all the neighbors saying, oh, it's so terrible, and the farmer going, yes, I know it's so terrible. And so you can see maybe that these parables and teachings have been set up to affect our critical thinking, but do it in a way that doesn't talk about critical thinking, doesn't talk about beliefs so much. It just gets us to see things. And this is why teachings are stories that are designed to bring about the change that's necessary. In this case, we're saying the change is a change from living life with the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome where suffering arises, to living life where that attitude of doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away.
To the topic we touched in the morning, that
say it again.
To the topic that we touched in the morning,
Yes.
That it looks like the source or God cannot be known in this reality. Can it be that this high intelligence is still manifesting in a way that is signing us that I am ruling your life, basically? I have a short example. Once I was driving very late a car. I was extremely tired. It was a long trip. I had 2 kids in the car. And suddenly I understood that my consciousness just switched off. And I was almost ready to fall asleep. And then in an instant, okay, everybody can understand what could happen when you drive the car with this. But in an instant, I had a kick inside. And I was fully back and fully driving again, and then I stopped and we changed the driving seats with some adult who was still in the car. And for me, it was the manifestation of this high intelligence that just took me out of the driving seat.
So a critical thinker hearing that, right, would say, it could be, but don't draw that conclusion, because what you describe can be explained by other explanations. And given it can be explained by other explanations, which we might not have the other explanations, and when we don't have the other explanations, then the explanation we do have that makes sense can be the one that we say, well, that's what it is. But as soon as we get another explanation, and we look at it and we go, oh yeah, that could explain it too, then we now say, well, there's 2 explanations and it could be either one. And so then we can't say which one it is. But we're not saying, so in the same way as I'm not saying God doesn't exist, I'm saying that a lot of the ideas that people have about God, I'm pretty sure that's not the God that exists, because you can see the ideas people have about God and can see how flawed those ideas are. But then when you put all the flawed ones, then there's various gods that could exist. But we need to know what this manifestation is in order to decide which God actually exists, because this manifestation, if it's a virtual reality from an advanced civilization, then the God of this world is very different to the God if this is not a virtual reality. And it's actually, let's say, what science says, and it's an evolution. And at some point, intelligence became part of that evolution. And that's why it can be so complex now, because intelligence was part of the development. So then the God is going to be something else if this world is actually an evolution. If this world is an arising in an impersonal, universal type God, as a virtual reality, but not the virtual reality of an advanced civilization, just like the Advaita says, that everything is Brahman, then God is different again. So in order for us to come up with a knowing of God, we first need to know what life is. And we can't know that. We can see that it could be one of several things, and then probably one of many other things that we haven't considered. So, why I had said this morning that we can't ever know God, and the best example is in a dream. Not saying this is a dream, but using the dream as the example. The dream character in the dream, so the main character, Roger 25, let's say, will never meet Roger 45, who is asleep and is the God. Essentially, Roger 45 is the God of the dream world that Roger 25 exists in. Now, Roger 25 can never meet Roger 45. The creation can never meet the creator. The best that can happen is that Roger 25 can become aware of the consciousness functioning through him, and understand if this is a dream of Roger 45, then the consciousness that he knows as his is the consciousness of Roger 45. And so he can say, well, that's the best that I can know of God, is the consciousness functioning through me is the consciousness of Roger 45, the dreamer of the dream. But knowing that means you know actually the core of yourself. You can say, well, that's God, but it's not all of God. Because Roger 25 hasn't met Roger 45 with all of his personality and his characteristics. He doesn't know what he looks like and all of that. He knows an aspect of Roger 45, which is really not separate from Roger 25. So whether we say that's God or that's what I am is the same. If we say that's God, then we're assuming we know what this world is, and we're assuming we know that this is all an arising within a universal mind. And it might not be that I am that functions, the consciousness that functions through us, might not be coming from a dreamer or God. It may well be, like science says, a result of very complex neurology. And when we have certain experiences, so this is also what we spoke about, if we have certain experiences, like awakening experiences, the experience feels a certain way, very mystical, and it feels like, oh, this consciousness has nothing to do with the body-mind. That's what the feedback from an awakening experience is. Once again, humans, because we haven't developed critical thinking, will draw a conclusion about, oh, now I know that the consciousness has nothing to do with the body-mind, because the experience has told me. In that experience, there is I am consciousness, but that consciousness is not from the body-mind, but rather the body-mind is within the consciousness. And so then we go around going, oh, now I know what reality is, based on a conclusion of what an experience is telling us. Now, experience is relative. What if the experience is the experience of a human, and it, because of certain neurology, the human experience is one that says this is not a human experience. So if we go based on what the experience is telling us, which is this is not a human experience, that the consciousness here is not of the body-mind, and we believe that as truth, we've made a critical thinking error, which means a belief sets in based on our interpretation of an experience that is relative, but we have taken it to be absolute because it feels a certain way. So in the case that you described, driving along, you go to sleep, and then you wake up, and you say...
I really felt a kick.
A kick, yeah. And so the experience, so I respect that you describe it as you felt it. So it felt like someone was saying, hey, it's not your time to die yet, wake up, type of thing.
This interpretation can sure have place, yes.
Yeah. When we look at the intelligence of the body and what it's capable of doing in terms of the immune system and all sorts of things, something that we don't tend to appreciate is what intelligence can do, like what intelligence can create. We can just see it. Human intelligence can create the world we see around us, all of the technology, and it's only going to get more and more complex and more impressive. That's what intelligence can create. That intelligence has created the body and the brain and the immune system. And that kick could be the kick of the body that before it fell asleep said, I'm tired, this is not good. If I fall asleep, anything, it can crash into a tree, kill my kids. And then the tiredness takes over, and that kick might have been the kick of the intelligence in the body that we don't understand, but it remembered that it had registered, if I fall asleep now, it's very dangerous. The system might have registered, I'm asleep. The system that is still functioning, but the conscious, you're asleep, wake up. So the intelligence could be kicking you. And it can feel like what you interpreted it as, and it could be either of those. At the end of the day, what I'm talking about and what you're talking about is something very profound, whether it's intelligence that is a result of evolution or whether it's the intelligence of a universal God. It's either way, life is profound. The human being is profound. And so it doesn't matter, we can't reduce that profundity down to something that is not profound. It is profound. What I'm spending time on nowadays here is trying to refine some of the belief systems that have been put in place that were so important at bringing about changes that needed to happen. But until those are refined out as well, we're still running around with beliefs in the system that are beliefs that will get in the way of our peace of mind. And so coming to see that even if this is all a spontaneous creation in a universal mind, we can't deny that the spontaneous creation is a creation that includes in it the functioning of cause and effect. So whatever happens in life has included in the story of life, there is a causal explanation for whatever happens. Now, we have to be open to say that causal explanation might not be the ultimate cause. And yet, the ultimate cause has included causality as the mechanism by which things unfold. So when we come to look at thoughts, for example, thoughts, when they are there, they correlate with activity in the neural network. And so the causal link is there. And if in the manifestation a neuroscientist puts some probes into the brain or cuts certain brain stems or whatever, then they see that certain functions stop happening. And so the causal link is undeniable. Now, whether that is the ultimate reason why things happen is questionable, but we can't deny that the causal link is there. And so then if the causal link is there and it's consistently there, there's no harm in explaining everything through causality. Because the causality and the spontaneity, if that's the two that coexist, if it is really a spontaneous creation, an imagination in the mind of God, God has imagined a world of causality. Means everything that happens will have a causal explanation. And once again, it's a lack of critical thinking that says, oh, causality is only apparent and therefore can't explain everything, and what is real is the non-duality, for example. Whereas when we look at it more clearly, you see, no, the causality and the non-duality are not separate. They are both equally true. You can't, so if that's the case, you can look at anything, any part of the whole, and know the whole. So if we explain it from the causal, even if the causal is not the ultimate, it is still a valid explanation. In the same way, there is how is it? Everything is Brahman. The world, or only Brahman alone is real. The world is illusion.
The world is illusion, only Brahman is real, Brahman is the world.
Yes, something like that. And so what that is saying is, on the one hand it's saying there is Brahman which is real and the world which is illusion, but then it's saying Brahman is the world, which means the world is that which is real. So this is the paradox, which means you can look at the world, which is illusion, and know Brahman, because Brahman and the world are not two. So in non-duality, we often, because of the way that the changes happen, we, for a while, create the ultimate of dualities, which says, oh, this is not real and this is real. I am not the body, I am consciousness. That at some point the two they come together and there's an integration, and it's like it just all is what it is. No separating out. And then what it is you look and you see that even after enlightenment you still have memory. So time continues to present, because memory arises. As soon as memory arises, it creates time. After enlightenment, you still have thoughts of at least the working mind. After enlightenment, you still have to turn the kettle on to get hot water. You still have to live as if there is a here and a there, as if there is time, as if causality is real. So if causality was illusion, if time was an illusion, after enlightenment there would be no more causality, no more time, which means the person would no longer function acknowledging causality, acknowledging time. Whereas you ask the sage who might have seen through causality and time as absolute and says, well, it's not absolute. Just like a scientist has seen that there is quantum physics and mechanical physics. The person who understands quantum physics won't ignore mechanical physics. You have to build your house using mechanical physics. And yet they can understand that on a deeper level it's quantum physics that exists, but not independent of mechanical physics. The two coincide and coexist. And it's a big mistake if we start understanding quantum physics and then think that mechanical physics don't exist. Or think that if I understand quantum physics, then mechanical physics is not real. And that's what happens in non-duality. It's just a function of the development of the brain until the brain realizes, until the intellect realizes what it's doing. And sometimes it requires some pointing out to say, hey, do you realize this is what your intellect is doing? It's come to understand and see non-duality, and now it's ignoring what still exists, which is the duality and the causality and the time.